In this presentation, we're going to be discussing the cosmic warfare theodicy. Theodicy is a technical term that refers to responses to the problem of evil. If God is good, if God is powerful, why doesn't he put an end to the suffering and evil in the world? The word itself comes from the Greek language, as a lot of our technical terminology does. So um, the word theos is the Greek word from God, and dike is the Greek word for justice. So it's kind of like a composite word saying the justice of God. And it's an argument in the philosophy of religion that attempts to resolve the problem of evil that arises when an all powerful and all when all power and all goodness are simultaneously attributed to God. That is kind of like the formal definition of the term. Okay, so the the question of suffering is kind of straightforward. I mean, everybody realizes that evil and suffering exist in the world. Everybody realizes that sometimes people suffer even though they probably don't deserve it. Um, the question can be traced all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Um, it's sometimes called the Epicurean trilemma, and a more recent philosopher with the name of David Hume kind of articulated it in an interesting way here. It says, "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence comes evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God?" So this kind of poetic formulation of the question really brings out the issues that exist with this problem. So uh, basically, it's a logical problem. You have this triangle here. You have suffering on one end, and then you have a God that's all powerful and that's all loving. So if God is loving, He would want to put an end to suffering, just like a parent would want to put an end to the suffering of their child. And if God is all powerful, then He has the ability to do it. So then why doesn't He? So that is the what it's known as the logical problem of evil. Now, there's been a number of models, a number of approaches that have existed in Christianity and outside Christianity to address the problem of evil. So within Christianity, there are four common approaches. The first one is known as the greater good defense. And the idea here is that God orchestrates both the good and the evil in the world with the intent of eventually accomplishing some kind of greater thing that is so good that it justifies um, all the suffering and evil that have had to take place in order to get us there. So that's one approach to address the question. Another approach is somewhat similar, but it focuses on individual beings. It's called the soul making approach, and it's basically saying that God uses evil and suffering to help us grow as individuals. So just like you go to the gym and you have to put a lot of hard work if you want to build up muscle, the idea here is that for us to actually develop character, to become um, better persons, uh, to grow as individuals, we need to be confronted with various obstacles, various difficulties, suffering, and things like that in order for us to develop as individuals. So that's both the first and the second are somewhat similar, but they focus on different elements. Okay, another approach is known as process theism, and here the response has to do more with God than with creation. It says that God Himself is in the process of evolving. So maybe all this time we used to think that God is sort of this advanced being that is so much ahead of us in many respects. But this approach um, basically says that, well, God is still growing as an individual in some way as well. So maybe that explains why the world isn't as perfect as it should be. Another approach is known as skeptical theism. And here it's essentially kind of like saying we don't know. So basically, God is so much bigger than us, He's so much smarter than us, He's so far in advance of us that we just don't have the capacity to understand what's happening, to really understand why God does all this. So we're basically just saying like, I believe that God is good. I believe that God is all powerful. I believe that He has good reasons for allowing suffering, but I just don't have any way to explain that. I don't have any way to understand it, and that's okay because um, I'm only human, and God knows what He's doing. So that's yet another approach to the question. Now, each of these has its difficulties or its challenges. So, for example, the first one, the greater good defense, the question is, does the end really justify the means? So, for example, like some of you might have seen people that have strict parents, so maybe they force them to practice some instrument or to practice some sport or some activity, whether it's to get good at math or to get good at some uh, school subject, or and maybe everybody else is outside playing, but these parents are kind of forcing the child to stay home and practice their piano or practice their whatever sports they're in, or whatever it is they're doing, with the idea that in the end they're going to get so good that maybe they're going to become a famous musician or a famous sports player or something else, advanced, somebody that's advanced in technology or physics or science or whatever. So you might say, well, the parent is putting the child through all this um, stress and hardship of having to sacrifice playtime for working hard and doing their work. But in the end, they're going to become something special, so it justifies the means. But even in that kind of a situation, um, there's a limit to how far such a parent should go before it becomes abusive. So you can imagine a parent that is so strict that they go overboard and they subject their children to too much hard work, too much suffering, too much hardship, and then at that point it no longer, you can no longer use this idea of a greater good because it's just too much. And the same could be applied to God. You might say, well, okay, maybe some suffering in the world would have made sense, but um, the level of suffering that this world faces is way more than would justify any kind of greater good in the end. So, in other words, there's a response to the problem of evil, and that's the greater good defense, and then there's a counter argument, and the counter argument that maybe it goes too far. The same with the soul making argument. Yeah, we can understand that if people face hardship, they might grow in character, they might grow as a person, but it seems like you could achieve the same level of character growth without the degree of suffering that exists in the world. Like a lesser degree of suffering seems like would still achieve a significant level of um, character growth and so on. So it doesn't seem like it's necessary um, for the evil and the suffering that exists in the world to be as much as it actually is. All right. So then the other approach, the process theism response, this one basically says that God Himself is growing as a person, growing as an individual, or sometimes this is articulated as saying that God has a certain type of character that doesn't allow Him to interfere. God tries to encourage people to do better. He tries to motivate people, but He doesn't actually force people to change. It's up to them. All these different approaches, you might say, okay, well, yeah, if if God is maybe not as omniscient or as omnipotent or whatever, he has certain limitations, then maybe it would um, explain some of the problems that exist in the world. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, how evolved does God have to be to realize that there's a time to step in and do something? And we can look at the world and say, yeah, the world has reached a certain level of evil and has had a certain level of evil for thousands of years now. That doesn't seem like I mean, it seems like any God that is even relatively immature or relatively limited would still feel the need to step in and put an end to the suffering, or at least limit it in some sense. So again, this doesn't seem like um, a, a fully compelling solution to the problem of evil. And finally, the skeptical theism response. This one says, well, maybe God is too great for us to understand. And that might be okay to some degree, but at some point, you have to question how it is that even though Christianity has been around for 2,000 years, and before that, Judaism, which is kind of the precursor to Christianity, has been around for another 1,000 or more years. And people have been wrestling with these questions for all this time, trying to understand and trying to figure them out. But somehow they still haven't been able to come up with any answer to this question. And it just seems like we should at least have some idea or some sense of why um, evil exists if we want to continue to affirm that God is good and God is all powerful. Otherwise, on what basis do we even make these claims? You know, how can we say that God is good, but at the same time have absolutely no explanation for the evil in the world and so on. Now, you could take each of these by themselves and they could become like a dominant response. Like, for example, you could talk to one person and their preferred explanation for evil is the greater good explanation. Another person, their preferred explanation is skeptical theism. But you could also kind of merge some of this together. So somebody might say, well, um, the greater good response kind of explains the situation, and for whatever degree it cannot explain the problem, then I appeal to skeptical theism to make up for the rest of it as well. So sometimes people kind of merge these together, but the problems or the difficulties or the challenges for each of these remain even when we connect them together and try to make like to use multiple responses at the same time. Okay, so these are some of the more popular approaches that are used by Christians. There's also responses by people that either are from other religions or that don't believe in God. So, for example, if somebody says God doesn't exist, then that can explain suffering. I mean, you know, if we're just a product of random forces of nature that go back, you know, infinitely in time, there's no reason to expect that the world would be any better than it is. So, you know, everything that's happening is a result of chance. And sometimes, on top of that, you have natural selection with people and animals and everything competing for resources. And of course, because of that, there's going to be suffering, there's going to be things that appear evil and so on. So that might explain it, but obviously for Christians, that's not a solution. So, you know, within Christianity, Christianity claims that God exists, so it cannot appeal to that as an answer to the problem of evil. Another response might be that God is evil. Again, this is not an option for Christians because Christianity is based on the idea that God is good. We might say that God is powerless. This one becomes a challenge by the very definition of what we mean by God, because if God created the universe, he seems to have some power at least. I mean, creating a universe seems like a major task. And if God has the power to create the universe, then um, he should have the power to intervene in some sense or uh, find a way to address the power of evil or the problem of evil. So it doesn't seem like a proper explanation. There's ways around this where people say, you know, God didn't actually create the universe. The universe was always around, but then that kind of defeats the purpose of the idea of God. You know, if God didn't create the universe, then why exactly do we call him God to begin with, and so on. Other approaches might be to say, no, God is good and he's powerful, but it's suffering. Suffering isn't real. And this, you know, there's some religions in the world that try to say things like suffering is an illusion. Um, in Buddhism, for example, people might say that suffering is a result of desire, and if we don't have a desire, um, then there's nothing. You know, like if we basically expect not to be comfortable, if we expect to sense pain and all the different things, if we don't have a desire for something better, then the suffering isn't really there. Um, in Christianity, usually suffering is not denied. It's taken as a fact of a fact of life. So yeah, it's kind of hard to say to take this approach within Christianity because in Christianity we confront the idea of we tend to confront the idea of suffering head on as opposed to dismissing it or denying it. Another approach is known as cosmic dualism. This one says that instead of having one God, you have two gods or two forces. One is good and one is bad. And the reason there's good in the world is because there's a good God that's working for good. But then there's a bad God that's just as strong and it cannot be defeated by the good God. And this bad God is constantly stepping in and doing bad things. And there's this back and forth between these two opposing powers. Um, and that's why you have both good and evil in the world. Another similar approach is still a form of cosmic dualism. It's the yin yang idea that you find in some Eastern religions. And here, it's not so much that there's a good God and a bad God. It's more that there's two opposing forces, and neither one is good or bad, but they're just opposite to each other. So if one attempts to work things in a different in a certain direction, the other one is always pulling in the opposite direction. So what you have in the world is not so much good and evil, but you have things going in one way or going into the other, and to the individual, it seems like something is bad when in fact it's just kind of two opposing forces at work. Again, this is not something that's compatible with Christianity, even though maybe some heretical movements throughout the history of Christianity have appealed to this approach. But in Christianity, the central theme is that there's one God and that this God is good and that everything else is created. So it's not in a position to oppose God. So if if something is bad, it's created, and it doesn't have the strength to fight against God because God is the one that created everything, is stronger than everything. So all of these are approaches that exist and that people have appealed to in the past in different contexts, but they're not really useful from a Christian perspective. All right, so finally, kind of having looked at all these different options, today I'm going to introduce yet another approach besides the four that are typically used by Christians, and this is known as the free will or cosmic warfare approach. And this one says basically that there's a hidden battle that's going on between the forces of good and the forces of evil that is the result of having created beings with free will. And I'll explain what this means in a second, but there's two parts to this approach. And the first part is the part about free will. So the idea of free will seems to be a solution to the Epicurean trilemma, which is what we read earlier, where if God is good and all powerful, then why is there evil? So you have this triangle that seems to create a logical impossibility. If God is all powerful and God is all good, then suffering shouldn't exist. But then this idea of free will seems to be a solution to this problem. And the solution is basically this, that you could have a good God that has power to change things. But if God creates an individual that has free will, and this individual chooses something evil or chooses to do something that's harmful or that causes suffering, if God prevents this person from doing those things, then essentially God is taking away their free will. So if God wants to create beings with free will, then he, in a sense, must at the same time allow them to exercise their free will. If they're not allowed to exercise their free will, then they don't really have it. So basically, it's kind of like, either God creates robots that cannot help but do only those things that God has programmed them to do, or God creates beings that have free will, and then these beings might do some things that are good, but they might choose to do some things that are bad, and then that will result in suffering and or evil. And God might allow it to happen just because He has given them the capacity for free will. So if they have it, they should be allowed to exercise it. So essentially, this idea of free will uh, has the potential to be a resolution to this logical puzzle. How can there be an all powerful God? How can there be an all loving God? And how can there be suffering and evil at the same time? Well, if free will exists, that seems to allow at least some possibility for evil to exist as a choice of the individual that is exercising that free will. All right, so this is a potential solution to the question, but it's an incomplete solution. It's a it's a partial solution because while it might explain the idea of evil and suffering in general, it doesn't really it doesn't fully address the situation that exists in our world as we see it today. Because there's a lot of things in our world that are not really the result of free will. So, for example, you have children or babies suffering or experiencing the consequences of evil, even though they haven't done anything. They're too innocent, they're too immature to make conscious decisions, but they still suffer the results. And then you have animals that don't even have the capacity to make those kinds of moral judgments, and yet they still have to suffer. And then you have casualties of various situations. So, for example, somebody gets on the road and gets drunk and starts driving their car through the city and runs over somebody crossing the street. The person that suffers hasn't done anything wrong. They're just minding their own business, crossing the street, but they're suffering because of somebody else's exercise of free will, and that doesn't seem right. They're not the ones that have done the thing that's causing their own suffering. So why should they have to suffer it? So these kinds of problems um, don't have are not fully addressed by the idea of free will. So there's a need for something more. There's a need for a fuller explanation if we're going to address the problem of suffering adequately. So the expanded solution that we have, uh, one of the ways it's known, is as the cosmic conflict. Sometimes it's called the warfare theodicy, and so on. So there's different names for it, different ways that people have labeled it in the past. But I will expand the idea as we continue on. But essentially, um, it's an attempt to take the free will solution to the problem of evil and expand it in such a way that it addresses more fully the problems that we see in our world. But before we get into the explanation, what I want to do is first I want to do a survey of biblical passages that provide the components for the solution, so that it's not just something we're making up, but it's actually tied to the Christian perspective through the biblical writings. So I'm going to have a series of passages and just read them and kind of comment on them. All right, so obviously uh, the first passage we're going to start with is the famous passage in Genesis, which describes the fall of man, fall of Adam and Eve. And this seems like the beginning of where the problem starts. So it says, now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? The woman said to the serpent, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die. You will not certainly die, the serpent said to the woman, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to the husband who was with her, and he ate it as well. So that's from Genesis 3 to 1 to 6. So here, the the idea that the consequences that or the evil in the world are a result of a choice that Adam and Eve made when they disobeyed God and they ate from this tree. And prior to that, the world was perfect and it didn't have evil and it didn't have suffering. So this is kind of the introductory theme with which scripture starts, but it doesn't really provide an explanation of where this snake or serpent came from, why it's there, why it's allowed to do this. The beginning of the Bible doesn't explain it, but it just introduces this idea. So now we continue on with different parts of the Bible and kind of gather together bits and pieces, kind of like puzzle pieces that we can put together into a coherent picture. Okay, so this is the book of Job. It's halfway through the Bible, right before the book of Psalms. And it goes like this. In the land of Uz, there lived a man named whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. That's Job 1 to 3. But then he goes on a few verses later. One day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth, going back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." So that's verses 6 through 12 from Job 1. Okay, so what we have here seems to be something that theologians call the divine council. And there seems to be this idea that the sons of God, so there's these beings from that God has created from um, from like a heavenly society that we're not really told much about in the Bible, but they seem to come together to this council meeting with God. And then Satan shows up and God says, "Where are you coming from? Or why are you here?" kind of. And Satan says, "Well, I'm coming from the earth," with the implication that basically the earth is more or less his. Like he pretty much is kind of like the boss for this planet. And then God kind of pushes back on that by pointing to this person named Job, who is still faithful to God. So essentially, not everybody on earth has turned themselves over to Satan. So okay, so that's another kind of a piece of the puzzle there. Now we go all the way to the New Testament, and here we read about the temptations of Jesus. So soon after the baptism of Jesus, it says, "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, 'If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread.' Jesus answered, 'It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God.' Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. 'If you are the Son of God,' he said, 'throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone.' Jesus answered him, 'It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test.' Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And all this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended him. And that's Matthew 4, 1 through 11. So here we have this sort of one-to-one conflict that takes place at the very beginning of Jesus's ministry. So, Jesus is born, he grows up, he gets to about the age of 30, He goes to John the Baptist and gets baptized, and then immediately he goes to the wilderness and has this sort of face off with Satan, and Satan tries different ways to get Jesus to essentially kind of go against God's will for him, but Jesus resists all those temptations and eventually sends him away. All right, so moving on to another passage. Here you have Jesus talking to the Pharisees, and he tells them, or the Pharisees say, "We are not illegitimate children," they protest. "The only father we have is God himself." But Jesus says to them, "If God were your father, you would love me, for I have come here from God. I have not come on my own. God sent me. Why is my language not clear to you? Because you are unable to hear what I say. You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there's no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies." That's from John chapter 8, verse 41 through 44. So here you have a confrontation between Jesus and the Pharisees, who were the teachers at that point in time, kind of like the religious leaders. And they're upset with Jesus about his teachings. And they're basically saying like, "Hey, we follow God. We're not going to follow your teachings." And Jesus says, if you were followers of God, you would actually love me because I came from God, but rather you're the children of the devil. And then he goes on and says, he was a murderer from the beginning, and he doesn't have any truth in him because he's the father of lies. So here's a passage where Jesus is saying that it's not God that introduced evil things like murder or lies, but the devil is the one that introduced these things. Hmm. All right, so now we're gonna get a few more hints about who the devil is, and this is going back into the Old Testament to the book of Isaiah. We're gonna read from Isaiah 14 verses 12 through 14, and then the next passage is from Ezekiel 28, 13 through 17. So Isaiah says, "How have you fallen from heaven, Lucifer, son of the dawn? You have been cast down to the earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens, I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of the assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds, I will make myself like the Most High." And then the Ezekiel passage says, "You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned you: carnelian, chrysolite, emerald, topaz, onyx, jasper, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and beryl. Your settings and mountings were made of gold. On the day you were created, they were prepared. You were anointed as a guardian cherub, for so I ordained you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked among the fiery stones. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until wickedness was found in you. Through your widespread trade, you were filled with violence and you sinned. So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God, and I expelled you, guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to the earth." Okay, so these two passages kind of give us additional hints about who the devil and Satan are. Essentially, here he's described as Lucifer as being this this sort of um, you know, leader or head of the angels. So this very exalted being that was created perfect, and God made him to be special, and he was even uh, more beautiful than other angels, and he was to lead over them. He was kind of their leader, and at some point, because uh, Lucifer also had free will, as all the other creations. At some point, this being decided that he wasn't happy with being the head of the angels. He wanted to go higher, so he wanted to be like God himself. So he started off with pride. He started off with jealousy and with coveting something that belonged to God alone. And then from there, he began his rebellion against God. All right, so moving on. So here's a parable that Jesus told. It says, Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where did the weeds come from? An enemy did this, he replied. The servants asked him, Do you want us to go and pull them up? No, he answered, because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them into bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. That's from Matthew 13. So now Jesus, while talking to the disciples, after he gave this parable, he gives them the explanation. So then he left the crowd and went into the house. And his disciples came to him and said, Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. He answered, The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let him hear. That's from Matthew 13, 36 to 43. So basically, now Jesus provides kind of an explanation for why he doesn't interfere with evil in the world. So he says, okay, so you have this good person that goes out and puts the seed. So he spreads the seed in the field. And then you have an evil person who in this parable is obviously the devil, who comes and throws out the weeds among the good seed. And then the servants say, well, how about we go and pull out the weeds? But the master is afraid that if he pulls out the weeds too early, it might damage the grain as well. So he says, let them grow together until the harvest, and then they will be separated. So basically, God God is allowing time to pass. So before he separates the good from the bad and puts an end to evil, he's going to allow time to pass because he doesn't want to damage the good in the process of removing the evil. So already we kind of have an explanation of where evil comes from and why God is allowing it to exist, at least temporarily until this harvest, which refers to the end of the world when Jesus comes back and brings things to a close. All right, so I want to also mention the idea of demons, so that because they're also part of these. And here's a story. It says, when Jesus got out of a boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the iron on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stone. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of that area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside, and the demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." So he gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Right? That's from Mark 5, verse 12, verse 2 to 13. So here we have a story that doesn't talk about Satan or Lucifer, but it talks about demons or unclean spirits, impure spirits. So I don't have the passage up here, but I have. There's another passage where Jesus describes Satan as the leader of this unclean spirits or the leader of the demons. Um, yeah, and so that kind of gives us an idea of who the spirits are. Um, so one more passage here. This one is from Ephesians chapter 3. It says, his intent was that now through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in heavenly realms, according to his eternal purpose that he accomplished in Christ Jesus our Lord. And here I say that, remember we started off with the book of Job when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and then Satan showed up as well. Here's another hint to these rulers and authorities in the heavenly realm. So you have these beings that are part of God's divine counsel that are watching what is happening in the world and following and learning about God's wisdom through the church, through God's church as it's fulfilling its mission in the world. All right, so final passage from the book of Revelation, which is the last book of the Bible. It says, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his head. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that he might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, the ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth and his angels with him. All right, so the book of Revelation is kind of symbolic. So it uses this imagery of a dragon trying to devour this baby that is being born. And this is a reference to Christ because her child is to rule all the nations with an iron scepter. But then we're told that the dragon represents Satan and the devil, and the one or on the top paragraph it says he swept a third of the stars of heaven. In the bottom paragraph it tells us that the dragon and his angels fought. So basically, Lucifer managed to get a third of the angels to side with him in this war, and he started a war against God, and then came to Earth, and basically he convinced the whole world to follow him pretty much. Okay, so those are some passages from the Bible. They're not. It's not all that there is. There's other passages that we could have used, but this is kind of a survey throughout the Old and the New Testament of different puzzle pieces that we can kind of put together and get a sense of what the Bible is describing here. Okay, so now let's kind of summarize what's happening. So we have God, and God in the Christian tradition is understood as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or as a Trinity. And this triune God is the only being that is self-existent. So God has always been there; He has always existed, and He is the source of everything else that exists. All other beings are created beings. So at some point in history, God created the angels. God created humanity. And it seems that we are not the only things that were created, but other civilizations were created by God, just like how Genesis describes God creating this world as a world that is pure and without sin. God seems to have created other worlds, and these worlds also have their representatives that are part of this divine council that is described both in the book of Job and in Ephesians, there as authorities and powers. And then you have another set of beings that are the Bible calls angels, and these are kind of like God's immediate servants that basically um, um, do his whatever needs to be done, his messengers, and they are kind of intermediaries between God and the worlds, all these different worlds that God has created. Now, when the angels were originally created, they were also created pure and holy and without sin. And Lucifer was either one of the leaders or their main leader, um, or the head of the angels, um, uh, basically created to be kind of like the one in charge and to run the army of the angels. All right, so then what you have is you have Lucifer, who comes to the place where he makes a decision to rebel against God, and then he manages to convince a third of the angels to follow him. And that means that the other two-thirds of the angels remain faithful to God and they continue to serve and obey God, while Lucifer and his followers decide to rebel. I should mention here that because Christianity has kind of been heavily influenced by Greek mythology and other pagan religions, um, we have these images of Satan and the demons as being these ugly creatures that look like goats or look like some kind of horned beasts with pitchforks and things like that. But that's not, there's no biblical basis for that. Um, the angels were created, these powerful beings that were um, supposed to be that looked very good, that were actually um, dignified and were created pure and holy and all this stuff. And just because they sinned doesn't mean that they suddenly became this ugly looking creatures. The Bible never describes Satan or the demons in that way. So when it talks about demons, it's actually referring to these evil angels or angels that have turned away from God. But if we were to see them, they would probably still look a lot like the good angels. It's just that their mind has changed in a sense, but not their physical appearance. Now, besides the angels, we have all these different worlds that God has created have representatives who are part of God's divine council. And the world, the earth, was supposed to be one of these worlds, but essentially we turned away from God because of Satan's temptation. So we became one of the worlds, a world that is in rebellion alongside Satan. So we have two-thirds of the angels that are still on God's side, and then we have all these different worlds that are still on God's side, and then one-third of the angels that are on Satan's side, and then our world has more or less turned to or become part of Satan's side of the argument. But not completely, because there's still people in the world that are trying to serve God and they're trying to follow Him instead. So we have this basically cosmic conflict, or this war that exists between God and all the created beings that are on God's side, and then Satan or Lucifer or the devil and all his angels or demons who are opposed to God. And then they more or less kind of took over our planet, but there's still people that try to turn away from evil and to serve God in spite of this. And that's kind of the battle formation that we have in this divine war that is happening behind the scenes. All right, so the underlying this whole conflict is this idea of a code of conduct, some kind of law, some kind of commandment system that exists, and based on which the conflict takes place. So, one way to think about this code of conduct is to think about what free will means. If a person has free will, they have the option to do many different things. And some of those things are good and some of those things are bad. So just think about your everyday life. So, you might wake up in the morning and there's a series of things you can do that are good. So you might get ready for work, you might prepare your breakfast, you might choose to eat uh, cereal, or you might choose to eat something else. So you might choose to eat at home, or you might choose to go out. All these things either have a positive impact or they're neutral. They don't have a moral, like a negative value, morally speaking. So you have all through the day, you have many choices and you make decisions, and you could do a lot of different things, and all of them could be good things. But you also have the option of making choices that have bad effects. So you might choose to be mean to people. You might choose to cut people off on the freeway. You might choose to hurt somebody. You might choose to offend somebody with the things you're saying. Uh, every day we have many choices. Many of them are good, but some of them are bad as well. So the idea of free will is that you have a choice not only between good and bad. You have many choices for good and many choices for bad. And it's possible, theoretically speaking, it's possible for somebody to live their life making only good choices. And in fact, when God first created all these beings that we discussed in the previous slides, they were created in such a way that they lived their life making only good choices. Even though they had free will and they had the capacity to turn from God and to make bad choices, it was something that they had to choose to do. Well, for us, it's kind of second nature in a sense. We've gotten used to making the occasional bad choices, but when they were first created, they were always making the right choices because they were created with that capacity. Um, but the problem with bad choices is that they tend to be harmful to others in a sense. So, for example, I might um, decide to do something bad. Like, for example, maybe I'm taking the bus and somebody has their cell phone next to them and they fell asleep. I could choose to take it. So I'm making the bad choice, but by my taking their phone, I am doing something harmful to them because they spend a lot of money on that phone. They're going to have to spend money on getting a new one and so on. And who knows what other consequences might result from this. They might miss an important phone call, etc. So generally, even though we have the freedom to make bad choices, those choices are not done in a vacuum. They usually affect other people. They usually harm those around us. And because of that, in a perfect system, when God creates a perfect society, when He creates beings that are created in such a way as to make the right choices naturally, um, you know, He by somebody choosing to go against that and to do things that are are wrong, those things end up harming other people. And the problem is that God loves all the beings He has created, and He's it is important for God to be fair to all. Otherwise, it wouldn't be right if for God not to intervene on behalf of the people that are harmed, or the individuals that are hurt by somebody else's choice in some way. So essentially, the idea is that for for there to be a world without evil and without suffering, individuals that have free will must, of their own accord, make the decision not to make those bad choices. Now, what you have in heaven is people or individuals like Lucifer and all the other angels that followed him, who who don't want to live according to this code of conduct that is intended to create an environment that's fair to everyone, they want to be able to have free choice and to do anything they want, regardless of consequences to other beings, right? So they want to be able to make good choices and bad choices. And if that harms other angels or other created beings, then that's not their problem. They want to have the freedom to do that. And what you have is an impasse, basically, where you have God, whose responsibility is to have an environment where everyone is treated fairly, everyone is allowed to, to exist without being harmed and without being hurt. Um, and this environment requires, a harmonious existence of all created beings. And then you have individuals like Lucifer and all his followers who want to exercise their freedom at the expense of everyone else. So essentially, what happened is that there was no solution to this problem. You know, Lucifer wanted to live his life a certain way. Lucifer's angels wanted to live their lives in a certain way, but God, by if God allowed that to happen, then all the other beings would have been affected or harmed by this type of um, existence. All right, so we're going to take a quick break from what we've covered so far and take a short detour into the scientific method. In science, when scientists conduct an experiment, it's usually known as the double-blind scientific experiment. So scientists have several things that they tend to do. So usually when they want to do an experiment, they want to have a large sample size. They want to have a lot of participants, so that way they could test their hypotheses on many different individuals as opposed to just a few. They usually have a control group, so they might take their 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 participants and break them into two groups, and one is the one that's tested, and the other one is given some kind of placebo. So a placebo is like a sugar pill, for example, or something that where the participants don't know that they're receiving this fake thing, or they don't really know what the situation, that their situation is different, but they so if we were dealing with medication, um, the control group will get a sugar pill that has no effect, and the real participants will get the real pill. Okay, so now we get to the part about the experiment being double blind. And what this means is that neither the participants nor the people conducted the experiment. So if it's some kind of medication that is being tested, it's usually the doctors and the nurses and the people that are administering the medicine. Neither the participants nor the those conducting it know who's getting the sugar pill and who's getting the real pill. And scientists have found that for experiments to be valid, they need to create this environment that we might call epistemically disconnected. And what that means is that there's sort of this disconnect in knowledge where people don't really know what's happening. They're kind of doing the experiment in the dark, so to speak. So that way, the results are not affected by what the people do because they don't really know what's happening. They don't know who's getting the right pill, who's getting the fake pill, and that way they cannot influence the results one way or another. Other aspects of the scientific method is that the process is random, so um, there's no selection as to who gets which pill. Everything is done randomly. Then they collect the data, they analyze it statistically, they try to reproduce it by doing the experiment again somewhere else, and then they publish the results in journals. So all these components are the common process used by scientists to conduct an experiment. But an important part of this process is this idea of the experiment being double blind. of being epistemically disconnected or detached, so that the people in the experiment don't really know what's happening. So that way, their knowledge of what's happening is not affecting the results of the experiment. Now, keep this in mind as we go back to the to the idea of this cosmic warfare. Um, so within this cosmic warfare, we have Satan and his angels rebelling against God, but then they come and take over this world as well. However, this while this world becomes the stage of the conflict, and the reason for it is because maybe unlike other created civilizations, we actually um, went along with Satan while they didn't. Um, the difference with the conflict in this world is that there's this sort of double blind situation where human beings don't really know what's going on. You know, different people have different views of the world. They're raised differently. They have different background information. So it's kind of like a double blind experiment in a way because, well, first you have divine hiddenness. So we don't know if there's a God out there. We don't have like a direct um, demonstration that God is behind the scenes. We have this epistemic disconnect, like we don't really know what's happening, why we're here, where we're going. Um, so this world is sort of like this experimental situation where things are taking place and we don't fully have the knowledge of what's happening. Now, within this situation, there's some kind of rules of engagement, both for Satan and for God. So even though God is all powerful and God can step in and do all kinds of things, um, God uh, sets certain limits on himself and on Satan as well, because this way nobody is interfering with the results of this experiment. So we have the situation in our world where evil exists and there's consequences that result from evil over time. Century after century passes, different things emerge, different things result from this world that we live in. And both God and Satan are limited in how much they can do or how involved they become within our world. So we don't see Satan walking around just randomly killing people, for example. We don't see God showing himself and doing miracles and all this stuff all the time. There's this sort of disconnect, this sort of um, limitation to what both God and Satan can do for the sake of the data of the things taking place here, for the results to be valid, just like in a scientific experiment, where you need this double blind situation to have valid results. Now, whatever is happening here in this world is meant to be temporary. It's something that God is allowing for some period of time, but the consequences or the results of what is understood from what takes place here, the consequences are eternal and affects the rest of eternity. Um, so, what exactly is being demonstrated in this world as both God and Satan step back and allow this world to kind of run its course with people um, having been affected by evil in to some degree. So what we see is that all over the world there are multiple approaches to life. So there's multiple worldviews, multiple ways that people live. There's multiple religions, multiple beliefs about reality. Some people are atheists, some people believe in God, some people believe in magic, some people believe in all kinds of different things. They have different religions, different ethical systems, different views about what is right and wrong. All over the planet, millions, billions of people for thousands of years of history, they've come to life in different ways and they've tried to live their life in different ways. And there are consequences of each of these approaches that unfold over time. So, for example, say somebody develops a new religion in some part of the world. And as that religion takes over the population, it affects the population in some way. And over time, various things happen, and then people might realize, wow, things are not going that great. Maybe the way we think about our religion isn't the best. Let's make some adjustments. And maybe they fix some things, and then history continues on. And over time, new things emerge and new changes are made. And we have some religions that have been around for thousands of years, and we can see the results. But even if it's not necessarily a religion, but a way of life, different approaches to life, and we can see the results of these things over thousands of years as they unfold. And this becomes like a living experiment, a living demonstration of how life could be within the context of people be having this element of evil, because people are not always doing the right thing. People are selfish. People harm each other in various ways, and we see how different approaches interact with this human reality of the fact that we're not perfect beings, and we're looking for ways to coexist or to survive. Um, okay, so in the middle of all this, as all these different approaches to life are happening, God is also able to introduce his approach. So he could introduce it through the Jewish religion, and you know, as we look through the Old Testament, we see various things that God has done throughout history. Then finally, we have the incarnation of Jesus, and in the incarnation, we have something kind of special, because now it's not just different people living life in this world that is defective, but God Himself um, limits His own abilities, His own powers, His own capacities. He's he no longer he's no longer this divine being that's stronger than everything. He comes as a baby on earth, and is vulnerable, and then God Himself lives within this defective world, and shows us how it's possible to live even in a defective world as a human being, and to do it properly. But then we learn even more about God in the way He handles being mistreated, being tortured and persecuted and crucified, and in everything God does while here, we see a different side of reality in the way He interacts with this defective world. And then we see the results of the religion that was started as the result of God being here and living among us. So we have Christianity started by his followers, and then we see that unfold over hundreds and thousands of years. We see what happens when Christianity merges with the empire, and it becomes like the Roman Empire's religion, and the effects of that, and so on. So we could see how that develops over hundreds and thousands of years, alongside all the other things that are happening throughout the rest of the planet. All of this is happening um, with the intention that it's limited. In other words, it's not supposed to go on forever. It's just like a scientific experiment. It has some duration of time when all these different ideas, all these different things emerge, and we get to see them unfold over time. But at some point, it's going to be brought to a close. So eventually, before we get to the end of history, there needs to be some kind of evaluation of everything that has happened, where God's divine counsel and all these different worlds and Satan and his angels um, basically look at all that has occurred and what the consequences, what the lessons are, what is learned from this experiment of several thousand years. And when it's all said and done, and it seems like the data is sufficient to to draw the conclusions, then the second coming of Christ is going to happen, and the conflict is going to be brought to a close. But once that happens, then based on all that has occurred, the individual beings that have been in this conflict are going to have to make their decisions. Are they going to side with God and live in a universe where every being limits its own free will? In other words, it's not God forcing them to do this, it's they themselves making a decision that even though they have the free will to do many different things, they're going to limit themselves to doing only the good things, because they don't want to harm any other being that exists, so that all of the beings can coexist in harmony, and they can live in a universe without evil and without suffering for the rest of eternity. Or besides this group of people or beings, there's going to be another group of beings that say, no, I want the freedom to do anything I want anytime without any restrictions, even if that is harmful to others. And so there's this second group of beings, whether it's Satan or it's his angels, or whether it's human beings that have participated in in uh, in this world and have come to identify themselves with Satan's way of life. They're going to continue to be rebellious, and they're going to insist on having their own way. And then basically the entire government of heaven, having had this opportunity and this chance to see the effects of evil over time, and have had plenty of chance to observe different ways of things, or different views and different perspectives and how they've unfolded. Now they have sufficient data to say, okay, no, we're not gonna uh, we're basically not, we're gonna go along with this perspective of reality that God is proposing, where everyone lives in harmony. We're going to submit to this situation where people live according to the universe's rules of conduct, so to speak. And then those that persist in rebellion, they are going to have to essentially be receive some kind of capital punishment, because there's no way to change their minds. They've made their decisions, they made up their mind. They're going to persist in this way of life, and if we allow them to exist, all they're going to do is to continue to harm each other and harm the rest of us. And since there's nothing we can do it further to change, they've had all these opportunities, all this time to change, all this evidences that their way of life doesn't work. Then they're going to receive some kind of capital punishment. And once that is done, the last remains of suffering and evil are done away with. And then for the rest of eternity, you have a universe where everything lives together in harmony. So that is basically the picture that is painted by the Bible in terms of why evil and suffering exist and what the end goal is. All right, so in spite of this entire explanation, people might still have other questions. So sometimes people will say things like, "Well, why didn't God just destroy Lucifer? He could have destroyed him at the beginning and not have had to go through this whole ordeal, and not have had to deal with all the evil that exists in the world and all the suffering." Others will say, "Well, how long? Why is it taking so long? Why do we need this much time?" Or some might say, "Why do we need such a high degree of suffering for this experiment?" Some might say, "Well, how much longer is this going to last? Hasn't it been enough? Do we know when it's going to be finished? How do we know it's even true? Or what exactly should I do about it? If I'm part of this cosmic warfare situation, what is my part that I should be playing in this whole thing?" Okay, so let's take them one at a time. So, what about destroying Satan? Why didn't God destroy Satan? The problem with just destroying Satan at the very beginning. So let's say, God creates this perfect universe. There's all these beings that are living in harmony. And then one individual, Lucifer, decides that he wants something better. He wants to live a different life where he's not going along with all these rules, and he wants to be kind of like God and make up his own rules and all this stuff. God could have just stepped in right there and just killed him right there, and none of the rest of the stuff that happened would have happened. The problem with this would have been the suspicion that would have caused for everybody else. Why did God kill him? Like, what exactly did he do? Wasn't there a lighter punishment? Wasn't there a different way to solve the problem? It would have caused fear. It would have caused suspicion and confusion among all the other beings in heaven, um, as to why God would choose to address it in this way. Or somebody might say, well, why did God just not create Lucifer to begin with? Why not create somebody else in his place? But this might not have been a solution either, because maybe a few more years down the line, somebody else would have rebelled instead of Lucifer. So um, maybe that just would have been a solution. You would just have delayed the problem to a future time. Okay, so then why so long or so much suffering? Now, there's several elements here that I think are pertinent to addressing this question. So first, I think we've been taught, even within Christian circles, to have a concept of God where God is basically like this absolute ruler of the universe. He does whatever he wants and everybody listens. But this idea of the cosmic conflict describes God or God's government more like a democracy than a monarchy. So there's this idea of this divine council, of leaders from the various worlds that God has created, and maybe even some of the angels that essentially cooperate with God in running the universe. So this is not to say that God lacks power. This is to say that God is the kind of God that is willing to give away some of his power in order to give others a chance to rise and to take part in the leadership process. So we tend to blame God for the suffering in the world, but part of the answer is that God is not the only one that's in charge. There's this group of beings that are that God is kind of lessening himself in a sense, and allowing them to participate, so they're making decisions together. But the difference is that while God is omniscient and God has a full understanding of what's happening, what evil is, what sin is, what the consequences are going to be thousands of years in the future, these beings don't have that capacity. They're not omniscient. They haven't always been around like God was. So they need to learn things over time. So it's not, the dynamic is somewhat different there. So that's one element. Another element is the question of what is the proper duration or size of a scientific experiment. Um, so if we're gonna think of what is happening in this world, kind of in the way we think about a scientific experiment that has this sort of double-blind uh, restrictions placed on it for the sake of impartiality and for the sake of having trustworthy data or trustworthy results, how do scientists go about deciding what is the size of a clinical trial in order to get good data? And a lot of times, people who are not scientists have a hard time figuring that out by common sense. It's usually the kind of thing that scientists figure out through much experience and through statistical models and mathematics and things like that. So, for example, for the COVID vaccine, I believe the clinical trials had as many as 50,000 participants, and they took quite a bit of time. And what you have in this situation is lay people, so people that are not scientists, who don't have the knowledge and understanding, that were criticizing the scientists. And some were saying like, hey, why do you need so many people in the clinical trial? Why do you need 50,000? Why not just use a smaller number? And why do you need so long? Why do you need 6 months or a year or several years? Why not just push out the vaccine to the public after a few months and get it out there so we could save more people? You have a group that's saying it's too much and it's taking too long. But then you had another group that was saying it's not enough. The trials haven't been long enough. It's not safe to get the vaccine to the public. It's experimental and all this stuff. So people were kind of on both sides of the question. Some were saying it's too long. Some were saying it's not long enough, or and so on. So it's hard for somebody who doesn't have the full picture of what's going on to get a good sense of what what size a clinical trial needs to be. And I think it's the same way with our situation here. We're part of this experiment, but it's hard for us to really step back and know how long such an experiment needs to be and what degree of suffering God has to allow in order to for the experiment to be valid and to have lasting impact. We've already talked about the fact that most things need time to unfold. So you have civilizations that develop over time. It takes centuries for them to be established. Eventually, maybe they deteriorate, and other civilizations take over, and all these things take time. Religions take time to develop. Even God's character and Satan's character became things that were being revealed to the universe over time by the way God interacted with humanity and the way Satan interacted with humanity over time. It gave the universe a revelation of who God is and who Satan is. And all these things take time. So it's not something that can happen overnight. Sometimes things take hundreds, even thousands of years to unfold. Um, then another thing we can do is we can kind of reverse our perspective and say, how would we think about this um, if we're way out into the future after the experiment is over? So let's say Jesus comes, human history is brought to an end, the decisions are made, and then eternity into the future passes. So we live for another 1,000, 10,000, a million, 10 million, a billion years. So a billion years from now, what if somebody starts to revisit the question of whether they should rebel again, or sin again, or do something evil again? They might look back and say, well, why should an experiment that only lasted a few decades or a few hundred years be enough to address issues that might arise for the rest of eternity? That experiment just wasn't long enough. It just didn't have enough data to be a compelling argument for me not to do this again in a different way at some point in the future. So again, looking at it from the long-term effects of this, what size of an experiment is long enough and big enough for the results to have a lasting impact for the rest of eternity? So individuals for the rest of eternity could say, "Hey, sufficient material is there for us to address any issue that comes up to the point where we don't have to try this experiment again." So we could look at it from the reverse perspective as well. So in terms of suffering, why doesn't God put a limit to the suffering? Um, and I would say, I think, at least based on the Bible, I think God does put limits on suffering. So the suffering we see in our world is nowhere near what it could be. I think if Satan had it his way, he would be going around torturing people left and right anytime somebody crossed him the wrong way. So I think God does put limits on suffering. But we might ask the question, why did God allow something like Auschwitz? Why all those people were allowed to suffer and be killed, during the Second World War? Um, but there has to be some kind of um, balance here in terms of what God does allow and doesn't allow. Because if God always steps in and puts a limit on the degree of suffering that exists in the world, then we would never have a sufficiently clear picture of what sin and evil can do and how badly it could get. So sometimes God has to step back and allow evil to reach some of this extreme degrees of suffering so that people understand how bad it could be. Um, and also, it seems that sometimes this has a change for good. So after World War II, many different countries were so horrified by what happened that they put in measures into making sure those kinds of things don't happen again. So there might be some respect in which human society, has grown as a result of suffering that has existed in the past. So that could also be a reason why sometimes God might step back and allow the suffering, if it helps society to improve and change in some way. These are not complete answers, in the sense that um, it's not fully sufficient to explain why people are hurting, or why different things have happened throughout history, but it gives us some idea of what could potentially be a reason for why it's happening. Okay, so the question of how much longer. The Bible does have something like we usually call it Bible prophecy. It has this sort of prophetic timeline, or kind of a divine schedule of what is happening. So if we look at what we've covered so far, then you have the perfect creation. So there's some period of time when all these beings were living in harmony and everything was good. Then Satan and Lucifer sinned, or he rebelled against God. He got a bunch of angels to follow him. And then when Adam and Eve were created, he managed to get them on his side. And then God allowed this demonstration to take place. So for several thousand years, human history has been going on, and various things have happened over this time, and um, various types of lessons could have been learned throughout this human history. Then we have a time when God Himself comes down and lives among us, and lives a human life and experiences the same things we're experiencing here, and provides a model of how to live a godly life even in a defective world. And then the Christian religion starts, and then there's quite a bit of time for Christianity to grow and develop. And then we see Christianity kind of being merged with the Roman Empire, and we see the effects of that over time. And then we get to a part where, according to Bible prophecy, we enter this period of final evaluation. So before the end of history, there's this period of time when the divine council and all these beings that are involved in this conflict look over all that has been accomplished and all that has been demonstrated, and decide whether it is sufficient and whether it's time to close the experiment. So at some point, the data will be sufficient, the experiment will be closed. So the Bible describes this as the second coming of Christ, where Christ returns with all his angels and essentially puts an end to history. And then after that, we have this final judgment and we have the rest of eternity. So according to Bible prophecy, we're kind of in this last evaluation phase, and we're fairly close to this pretty much uh, ending of this whole experiment here. So that's for the question of where we are in history, where we are in this whole process. So now somebody might say, well, okay, that sounds like an interesting explanation for suffering, but how do we even know it's true? I mean, it's just one explanation among many others, one religion among many others, and so on. And we don't even know if God exists and all this stuff. Uh, what a theodicy is, it's not really an evidence for the existence of God or an evidence for a particular religion or denomination. What it is an answer to a question, and that is the question of, is it possible for there to be a good and powerful God if there's so much suffering in the world? So this whole thing is basically just a way to explain that question. So the question of evil is explained by the idea of free will, but then the rest of the story that I spent quite a bit of time explaining provides this context that takes the idea of free will and expands it to where it makes sense within our world, where evil exists even for people that don't choose to do something wrong, um, or people that are affected by evil even though it's not their own choice. Um, so somebody might say, well, so again, how do we know if this is true then? The way we decide truth is a two-step process, or it has two different or distinct parts. One part is to contrast and compare plausible worldviews. So we look at the different things in the world, different ways that people have come to understand reality, and we try to evaluate them and say, okay, here's the most plausible options, and here's the one that makes the most sense. And each of us chooses a particular worldview based on what makes the most sense to us. That's one thing. But the other thing is, if a God exists, and if this God is a personal God, then God Himself might come and communicate with us directly in some way. So as individuals look for God, they can enter into a relationship with God even before they really understand what their options are. And in doing that, God might lead them to a potential worldview or a potential religion. And that's basically the process that people use to decide what they believe the truth to be. So one is to contrast possible worldviews. Another one is to seek God and to ask God to lead them in their evaluation of these worldviews. Usually, people do both of these together, and they both play a part. Now, what exactly do we do before we arrive at that conclusion? Like if we're still in the process of figuring out what we believe, well, it doesn't hurt us to live an ethical life in the meantime. So if I'm somebody that doesn't know what the truth is, doesn't know what to believe, is trying to figure out what the different religions are, what the different options are, and is looking for God in some way, in the meantime, until they find their answers, they can still live a good life. They can still be kind to people. They can still be loving. They can still help others. They can still do those things which they would want others to do to them, in the sense that they wouldn't harm others. They would, you know, um, help in whatever way possible. So we can live good lives even while we're trying to find the truth and figure out what our beliefs are. So this is kind of an extended explanation for the question of evil and suffering. If there are any questions or thoughts, feel free to send them to me.